Hello. In this video, I'm going to summarize a HBR article by Ghemawat entitled Managing Differences, the Central Challenge of Global Strategy. This was published in March 2007. In this article, Ghemawat explores how a firm's international or global strategy can address the large differences that exist across borders, geographic borders, but not only those. He stresses that the challenge is to not only address the tension between local adaptation and standardization to generate scale economies across operations. In addition, firms need to consider opportunities for arbitrage, exploiting rather than simply adjusting to or overcoming the differences they encounter. To aid with this, Ghemawat introduces his triple A framework, with each A standing for a distinct type of global strategy. Adaptation, that is boosting performance by maximizing local relevance. Aggregation, gaining scale benefits with regional or global operations. And arbitrage, locating separate parts of the business or supply chain in different countries to exploit differences. For example, call centers in India, factories in China, and retail operations in Western Europe. Now, most border-crossing enterprises draw on all three to some extent, but there are major tensions between the three approaches, and so strategic choices required in prioritization amongst the three A's. Ghemawat highlights how each A requires a different organizational design, the firm's configuration, its structure, approaches to coordination, the types of controls and approaches to corporate strategy that you'll put in place. For example, if a firm is emphasizing adaptation, it probably will have country-centered structure and considerable flexibility and variation in the approaches used in each country. Corporate strategy will focus on scope, the portfolio of countries the firm is operating in. In contrast, if aggregation is the primary objective, cross-border groupings, for example, product divisions, and global accounts will be dominant in the structure. And the corporate strategy will emphasize the realization of scale economies and the transfer of knowledge and competencies across the organization. Ghemawat says that an emphasis on arbitrage is often best pursued by a vertical, functional organization with a focus on balancing supply and demand within and across organizational boundaries. Corporate strategy focuses on identification and realization of those arbitrage opportunities. Clearly, not all three modes can take precedence in one organization at the same time, although some can be combined by, say, a matrix structure. Combining the modes carries significant costs. Therefore, organizations will tend to emphasize different A's at different points of their evolution. Ghemawat gives the example of IBM and Procter & Gamble. He argues that IBM started with an adaptation strategy, lots of mini IBMs in each country. Later, in the 1980s and 1990s, moving to an aggregation strategy to seek scale economies, but then more recently, seeming to seek arbitrage with its global services division. Ghemawat also uses the example of IT and business processing services companies, TCS and Cognizant, to show how different firms in the same industry can differ sharply in the A choices they make. TCS, historically seeking to exploit arbitrage, has also sought aggregation benefits, while Cognizant also exploits arbitrage, it has sought more local adaptation. In the article, Ghemawat offers a triangle framework for the three A's and suggests some simple proxies that can be used to quickly determine the importance of each of the A's to a firm. He suggests the ratio of advertising to sales is a good guide to how much adaptation is needed. While for those firms that do a lot of R&D as a proportion of sales, aggregation will be critical given the level of fixed costs they potentially incur. Finally, for firms where there is high labour costs, there is the potential to gain most from exploiting arbitrage. Managers are encouraged to use these proxies to map their firm on the triangle and to particularly pay attention to scores above the averages. Having introduced the AAA framework, Ghemawat goes on to consider how firms might consider two or more of the three A's. Firstly, he looks at combining adaptation with aggregation. He explains how initially Procter & Gamble struggled to mix local adaptation with global business units seeking scale, but then found a better balance by varying the emphasis on adaptation or aggregation in particular units, and also by using formal agreed decision grids to clearly define responsibilities for the market business development organizations, where the focus is on adaptation, and the global business units, whose emphasis is on aggregation. These structures are supplemented by softer tools to promote understanding and collaboration between the different types of business units. For example, co-locating the global business unit regional headquarters with the market development organization headquarters, and to be promoted above the director level, staff are required to have experience in both types of business units. So, specific mechanisms to deal with the inherent tensions between the needs of adaptation and aggregation. Next, Ghemawat looks at the combination of aggregation and arbitrage, and here looks at TCS. To balance the different needs of these two approaches, he describes how this firm has put in place a global network model with three kinds of development centres. First, the global centres serve large customers and have a depth of capabilities, scale, and mature coding and control processes. Typically, these are based in India, and at the time the article was written, some were being opened in China. The emphasis in these centres is on realising arbitrage benefits. For example, exploiting lower wage costs for highly skilled people. Secondly, the regional centres, such as those in Brazil and Hungary, have medium scale and selected capabilities. They have an emphasis on addressing language and cultural challenges. As such, they offer some arbitrage benefits, but not to the same extent as the global centres. Finally, there are the near-shore centres, such as the one in Boston in the USA. These have limited scale and focus on building the customer relationship through their proximity. So arbitrage in the relationship management. Note again, with TCS, the specific structural mechanisms to directly deal with the tensions between the two strategy modes. In the third of the three pairs, Ghemawat considers combining arbitrage and adaptation, and here uses the example of Cognizant. Cognizant have heavily invested in creating a local presence in key markets such as the USA. Success depends on the mix of adaptation in these local centres and the operations in India to gain arbitration benefits. What the firm calls its two-in-a-box structure. Mechanisms such as each project always having two global heads, one in India and one in, say, the USA, proposals being done jointly, training and acculturalization of all staff happening in India, and stringent recruitment processes all help ensure the balance of adaptation and arbitrage are maintained. While the emphasis in each of these examples, Procter & Gamble, TCS and Cognizant, is on structural solutions, Ghemawat also stresses the importance of softer mechanisms. He notes IBM's use of batching algorithms to allocate staff to projects based on not only their skills, but also on their personalities. In the article, Ghemawat next turns his attention to the major challenges a firm would face trying to simultaneously pursue all three of the A's. He highlights how the complexity may overreach available managerial bandwidth and go against approaches baked into the firm's culture and its external relationships. He also emphasizes the drag that dealing with these challenges will place on the firm's ability to compete with a rival who has focused on only one approach. Ghemawat's view is that for such a AAA strategy to work, the firm must be operating in an environment where the tensions between adaptation, aggregation, and arbitrage are weak or can be overridden by large-scale economies or structural advantages, or where the competition is constrained. There are strong echoes of the ABV, activity-based view, thinking of Michael Porter in this. In intensely competitive environments, the failure to choose a position and align activities to that choice will damage strategic performance. Ghemawat uses the healthcare diagnostic and imaging industry and its three key players, GE Healthcare, Siemens Medical Solutions, and Philips Medical Systems, to explore the challenges in pursuing all three A's concurrently. He argues that GE Healthcare, the largest of the three players, has been the most profitable due to its success with an aggregation strategy. This approach fitting well with the intensity of R&D in the industry. The industry ranks in the 90th percentile on the R&D expenditure to sales ratio that was flagged earlier as a proxy guide to indicate the importance of aggregation. Ghemawat also suggests that GE Healthcare has outpaced its competitors on arbitrage, being an early adopter of low-cost production centres. He also claims that the company's country-focused marketing organisation has also brought adaptation in the form of the provision of customer training and consulting services. Ghemawat argues that GE Healthcare has been able to include all these three A's by separating them into different parts of the organisation and then by downplaying the pursuit of adaptation. So actually, we might question whether GE Healthcare is really pursuing all three A strategies. Ghemawat, though, also suggests that GE Healthcare's success on all three is partly due to its competitors' weaknesses. And maybe as competitive intensity rises, then its attempt to pursue all three may prove an Achilles heel. Ghemawat then switches his attention to Philip's medical system and looks at how the 3A thinking could be used to develop their global strategy. At the group level, Philips has long followed a highly decentralized strategy with power in the hands of country managers, and so an emphasis on adaptation. However, given Philips' medical system's competitive environment, the adaptation advantage is more than offset by its aggregation disadvantages. It lags its key competitors on R&D expenditure and the deep pockets its rival parent firms. Created out of the merger of 6 separate companies, Philips' medical system had been diverted, and it lagged its peers and indeed other parts of Philips in realizing arbitrage benefits from low-cost production locations. Given its position at the time of the article, Ghemawat suggests the firm might have considered 2 strategy alternatives, either a combination of adaptation and aggregation or adaptation and arbitrage. To Ghemawat, the adaptation aggregation option seemed closest to the firm's then strategy. However, he argued that this was unlikely to solve Philips' medical system's aggregation disadvantage compared to its rivals, and so would need to offer more meaningful local adaptation to gain any advantage. And this might not be possible in this industry. The alternative, adaptation arbitrage, would aim not just at producing in low-cost locations, but would also mean a radical re-engineering of products and the organisation to cut costs, a move that would not fit well with Philips' heritage. Neither of these alternative approaches appears appealing, suggesting to Ghemawat that the firm is stuck with a structural disadvantage. He proposes a reconsideration of the scope of the firm to find areas where a pure adaptation strategy would provide more advantage. He suggests that Philips' then recent move into the home medical devices market might be a move in this direction. In the final section of Ghemawat's article, he pulls together the broad lessons that the AAA framework raises. Firstly, firms should focus on 1 or at most 2 of the A's to build competitive advantage. To do this, the firm needs to make a clear choice in the organisation, although choosing one of the 3 may not always be easy. Secondly, if the strategy involves introducing new non-trivial elements, you need to pay particular attention to how well they will work with the other things the firm is doing. There has to be an organisational fit. Thirdly, the pursuit of more than one of the A's requires creativity and breadth of thinking about integrating mechanisms to deal with tensions. This cannot be left to chance. So, requires deliberate attention to structures, systems, incentives, and to the culture and norms of the organisation. In this, we need to remember that not all the integration required will be inside of the organisation, and externalisation of some elements will be a part of most global strategies, whether this is via joint ventures, outsourcing, or more fluid customer relationships. Ghemawat's final lesson is knowing when not to integrate. Careful consideration is needed on what the firm does and does not tightly link together in the same system. It is sometimes better to keep diverse activities separate rather than having to mitigate the tensions that bringing them together would present. So, Ghemawat's AAA framework. Overall, I feel it's a useful way to review your global strategy and to bring more depth to thinking of how to deal with and even exploit differences across national borders. Thank you for listening.